Today we're going to talk about estimating with percents. More or less, you're going to do what you've been doing on other problems, except now we can use our knowledge of percents to estimate answers rather than get an exact. So if we ask you for a rounded answer or to estimate something, you're going to get a not perfect number, but something that's pretty close. So here's some tools that we can use for estimating. Compatible numbers. So here's an example of what we mean by compatible numbers. If we have, out of 50, 26 people with brown hair, a compatible number that's close to use would be 25 out of 50, so that you could easily say 50% of the people had brown hair. That's an example of using compatible numbers. Rounding numbers to where they're easier to use so that you can find a common percentage. The 10% rule is finding 10% of a number and then using 10% and manipulating it to get 20%, 30%, and so on. So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to use 50 again. If I wanted to find 10% of 50, all I have to do is move the decimal place once. Finding 10% is easy. So that would be like saying 10% of 50 is 5. Awesome. So then what do you think 20% of 50 would be? Well, I just have to double that. So that would have to be 10. 30% of 50? Well, I would just triple that. And that would be 15. It works very nicely even if you were to do, let's say, 25%, or you could do half of the 10% plus the 20%, so 25% would be 1250. And then another way to estimate is using common percentages, getting something to where the numbers work out nicely so that you have something like a fourth, and we would know that quickly as 25%. Or somehow getting it to 50%, 60 out of 120, so that you know it's 50%. Using those common percentages, rounding it to make your life a little bit easier. And if we're asking you about estimating, that's what you would choose to do. So looking at example 1, we're going to use common percentages here. And, well, kind of a mixture of everything. 10% of 61. 61 is not a great number to use when we're estimating, so let's round that to the nearest. You can do the nearest whole number or nearest 5, depending on what makes sense. In this case, 61 is very close to 60, so we're going to call it 60. 10% of 60 is just taking 60 and moving the decimal place once, so it's 6. Now, look how easy it's going to be to find 20% of 61. Once again, I'm getting rid of 61 and putting 60, because I'm estimating these. 20% has to be double that, or 2 times the 6, or 12, because 20% is double 10%. That's probably the easiest way to solve those problems. And then example 2, it says choose whatever method I'd like. So when I look at these, I want numbers that are compatible, that work well together. 21% isn't great, so I'm going to do 20%, and then 79 is really close to 80. So I'm going to have 20% of 80. Now, I'm going to choose to still do 0.2 times 80. So 20% of 80. Now, I'm going to use the 10% rule. 10% of 80 is moving the decimal once is 8. And then 8 times 2, that's going to be 16. That's one of the strategies you can use. You can also use your calculator, so don't be afraid to use that as well. 26% of 198. 198 is really close to 200. And then 26% would be 25%, because 25% would be a little easier to use, of 200. So if I know 25%, and we're going to use some common numbers here, 25% of 100 is 25, and there's going to be 2 of them. So times 2, that would have to be 50. And then lastly, we're going to do an application problem here. You've probably all went out to eat at some point with your family, and one of the easiest ways to use estimating is to tip. No one really wants to be tipped $4.22. You would want to round that, and speaking from a prior waitress experience, you would want to round it up to be kind. You and your family go out to Eaton Park for dinner one night. Your total bill is $49.15. If your family wants to give a 20% tip, what is the approximate amount of money that you should give the waitress? So a bill of $49.15, I would round that to $50. Always look at that and go, okay, that's pretty close to 50. So, and now I want to find 20% of that times 0.2. You could use the 10% rule. 10% of 50 is 5, then times 2 of that would be $10. 20% of something, find 10%, and then multiply it by 2.